The main wife bowed, but why? Okiyo froze in the doorway of Lady Sakai's chambers, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. In 5 years as Lord Sakai's concubine, she had bowed to the main wife hundreds of times, deep, respectful bows that acknowledged the vast difference in their positions. The main wife was the legitimate spouse, mother of the heir, mistress of the household. Okiyo was a concubine, elevated above servants but forever subordinate to the woman who held the title of wife. The hierarchy was absolute, unchangeable, as fixed as the relationship between earth and sky. Yet here was Lady Sakai, first wife of Lord Sakai Tadayoshi, daimyo of a domain worth 80,000 koku, bending at the waist in a gesture of respect toward a concubine. The serving women kneeling along the walls of the chamber kept their eyes downcast, but Okiyo could feel their shock radiating through the room like heat from a fire. They had all seen it. They would all remember it. And they would all understand what it meant. 3 days after the death of the legitimate heir, the balance of power in this household had shifted so dramatically that the rules governing 5 years of Okiyo's life no longer applied. Her 8-year-old son, born to a concubine and raised in the margins of the family, had suddenly become the most important person in the domain. And Lady Sakai, whose own son lay dead from fever, had just acknowledged a new reality that made Okiyo's position more dangerous than it had ever been before. Okiyo had been born in Edo, the daughter of a minor samurai official who managed tax records for the shogunate. Her family's status was respectable but modest. Her father's position provided adequate income but no wealth, respectability but no influence. She had 3 older brothers and 1 younger sister, making her the 4th child in a household that struggled to provide appropriate marriages for all its children. Her education had been more thorough than many girls received. Her father believed in learning and ensured all his children could read and write fluently, understand basic mathematics, and appreciate poetry and classical literature. Okiyo had shown particular aptitude for calligraphy and had studied under a teacher who praised her elegant hand. These accomplishments, combined with her pleasant appearance and quiet demeanour, made her a suitable candidate for a certain type of position. When she was 21, a marriage broker approached her father with a proposal. Lord Sakai Tadayoshi, daimyo of a domain in northern Honshu with an annual assessment of 80,000 koku, was seeking a concubine. His main wife had provided him with 2 sons and a daughter, fulfilling her primary duty. But the lord desired additional companionship, and his advisers suggested that a concubine from a samurai family with some education would be appropriate to his status. The position offered was specific and formal. Okiyo would become the lord's sokushitsu, an official concubine, not a casual liaison or temporary arrangement. She would live in the lord's mansion, receive a stipend for her maintenance, and have her own chambers and serving women. Any children she bore would be recognised as the lord's offspring, though they would rank below legitimate children in matters of inheritance and status. She would occupy a position above servants but below family members, respected but forever subordinate to the main wife. Her father had consulted with relatives and advisers about the offer. For a 4th daughter whose marriage prospects were limited, the position represented security and status she might not otherwise achieve. She would be maintained in comfort for life, protected by the lord's power, and any children she bore would have opportunities her siblings could not provide. The alternative was likely a marriage to a minor official of her father's rank, or possibly remaining unmarried and dependent on her brother's generosity in her old age. Okiyo had been given the choice, and she had accepted. At 21, she understood that this decision would define the rest of her life, but she could not have imagined how completely her identity would become tied to her position in Lord Sakai's household. The journey from Edo to the Sakai domain had taken 2 weeks, travelling by palanquin with an escort of retainers. She had never been so far from home before. The domain was in northern Honshu, in a region known for cold winters and hot summers, for rice cultivation and silk production. The castle town where Lord Sakai maintained his residence was smaller than Edo, but still substantial, with perhaps 30,000 residents including samurai families, merchants, artisans, and the various people who served them. The Sakai mansion was an impressive structure, built in the style appropriate to a daimyo of Lord Sakai's rank. The main residence consisted of multiple connected buildings arranged around courtyards, with separate wings for different functions and occupants. The Lord's private chambers occupied the central building. The main wife's quarters were in the east wing, the most prestigious location. Guest rooms and formal reception spaces filled the north wing. The west wing, where Okiyo would live, housed the Lord's study, storage rooms and spaces for concubines and their attendants. Okiyo's chambers consisted of 2 rooms, a main living space and a smaller sleeping area, connected by sliding screens. The floors were covered with fresh tatami mats, and the walls were finished with pale paper that let in soft light. The rooms opened onto a small private garden, just large enough for a few carefully placed stones, a dwarf pine, and a stone basin for washing hands. The furnishings were quality but not ostentatious. A low writing desk, cushions covered in subdued silk, a standing screen decorated with painted cranes, storage chests for clothing and personal items. A senior serving woman named Yuki was assigned to attend her. Yuki was perhaps 40 years old, a widow who had served in the household for many years and understood its hierarchies and customs thoroughly. She taught Okiyo the routines of the mansion, when meals were served, how to request anything she needed, which areas of the residence she could enter freely and which required permission, how to conduct herself when she encountered the main wife or other family members. "The lady is gracious and fair," Yuki explained, referring to the main wife. "She understands that you occupy a proper position granted by the Lord. If you show appropriate respect and do not presume beyond your station, you will find the household harmonious." The rules of Okiyo's position were both formal and unspoken. She was to be available when Lord Sakai desired her company. She was to maintain herself properly, her appearance, her chambers, her conduct, in a manner befitting her role. She was to show deference to the main wife at all times, acknowledging the vast difference in their positions. She was to avoid causing disruption or scandal. She was to understand that while she received the Lord's favour, she had no claim to authority within the household. In return, she received security. Her stipend provided for all her needs: food, clothing, servants, medical care if required. She was protected by the Lord's authority and status. She lived in comfort that most people in Japan could never hope to achieve, and she occupied a recognised position, with defined rights and responsibilities, rather than existing in the uncertain space of a temporary liaison. Lord Sakai was 43 years old when Okiyo arrived, a man in the prime of life with the confidence that came from inherited power and successful administration. He was not unkind to her, but neither was he particularly warm. Their relationship was formal and carefully bounded. He visited her chambers perhaps twice each month, sometimes more frequently, sometimes less. Their conversations were pleasant but never intimate. He appreciated her education, and sometimes asked her to write letters or copy documents in her elegant hand. He seemed to find her presence calming after the demands of governance and the complex social obligations of his position. She understood that she was one element among many in his life, neither the most important nor the least. He had responsibilities to his domain, to the shogunate, to his family, to the complex network of relationships that sustained his power. She was a comfort and a convenience, valued but ultimately peripheral to the serious business of his existence. The main wife, Lady Sakai, had been born to another daimyo family and had married Lord Sakai when both were young, their union arranged to strengthen alliances between domains. She was a woman of impeccable breeding and careful dignity, performing her role with the competence expected of her station. She had borne 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. The eldest son, Yoshitaka, was 14 years old and being educated for his future role as daimyo. The second son, Masaki, was 12. The daughter, Hana, was 10. Lady Sakai treated Okiyo with cold courtesy when their paths crossed, which was rarely. She acknowledged Okiyo's position as legitimate but made clear through subtle gestures that this acknowledgement involved no warmth or acceptance. Okiyo was a fact of the household, to be tolerated with dignity but never embraced. The lady-serving women followed their mistress's example, treating Okiyo with formal politeness that contained no genuine respect. Okiyo understood this dynamic and did not resent it. She had accepted her position knowing exactly where she would stand in the household hierarchy. She kept to her own chambers, performed her duties when called upon, and made no attempt to assert herself beyond her defined role. She cultivated relationships with the household staff who served her directly, treating them with kindness while maintaining appropriate distance. She occupied her time with reading, calligraphy, and the quiet contemplation that her position both required and enabled. The first year passed in this careful stability. She learned the rhythms of the mansion, the seasonal observances, the visits from relatives and officials, the complex social choreography that defined daily life in a daimyo's household. She became pregnant in her 8th month in the residence, and bore a son in the early spring of the following year. The birth of her son, whom Lord Sakai named Takamaru, changed her position subtly but significantly. She was no longer simply a concubine, but a concubine who had provided a son. The boy was registered in the domain records as Lord Sakai's child, though his mother's status meant he ranked below the legitimate sons. Wet nurses and serving women were assigned to help care for him. A small celebration was held to mark his birth, attended by senior retainers who offered formal congratulations. Lady Sakai sent a gift, a set of fine baby clothes, along with a brief note acknowledging the birth. The gesture was correct and appropriate, carrying neither warmth nor hostility. It said, "I recognize that your son is my husband's child, and I will treat this fact with the dignity appropriate to my position." Okiyo understood. Takamaru would grow up in the margins of the family, valued but never central, connected to power but never wielding it directly. If the legitimate sons lived and thrived, Takamaru would likely be found a position as a retainer in the domain, or perhaps married into another samurai family of respectable but not elite rank. He would have security and status by virtue of his father's identity, but he would never inherit the domain or the title. His position, like hers, would always be defined by what he was not rather than what he was. The years that followed established a routine. Okiyo raised her son with the help of serving women, teaching him herself when he was old enough to learn basic characters and numbers. Lord Sakai visited regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts, always treating her with formal courtesy. She watched her son grow from infant to toddler to young boy, healthy and quick-minded, bearing a clear resemblance to his father. She saw the legitimate sons occasionally from a distance, Yoshitaka growing taller and more serious as his education intensified, Masaki showing aptitude for martial training, both boys surrounded by tutors and attendants preparing them for lives of authority and responsibility. She felt no jealousy toward them or their mother. They occupied positions determined by birth and formal marriage, just as she and Takamaru occupied positions determined by different circumstances. This system was neither fair nor unfair, it simply was. In her 5th year in the household, Lord Sakai took a second concubine, a woman named Fumiko who was 19 years old and strikingly beautiful. Her father was a wealthy merchant who controlled important shipping routes and had been granted low-ranking samurai status through purchase. The alliance gave Lord Sakai access to commercial networks and additional revenue streams. Fumiko moved into chambers in the West Wing, 3 rooms down from Okiyo's. Okiyo greeted the younger woman with carefully neutral courtesy. She understood that Fumiko's arrival represented no threat to her own position. There was no competition between concubines for the lord's affection or favour. They occupied parallel positions, both peripheral to the household's power structures, both dependent on the lord's continued regard. Fumiko was nervous and uncertain in her first months, and Okiyo offered quiet guidance about the mansion's routines and expectations, remembering her own confusion when she'd first arrived. The household had settled into a new equilibrium that seemed as stable as the previous arrangement. Then, 3 days ago, everything had changed. The eldest son, Yoshitaka, 14 years old and healthy and being groomed for succession, had fallen ill with fever. Within 2 days, he was dead. The household had been consumed with grief and ritual. Lady Sakai had secluded herself in her chambers. Lord Sakai had met with his advisors about funeral arrangements and the various formal processes required when an heir died. Priests had been summoned. Messages had been sent to relatives and to the shogunate officials who needed to be informed. The mansion had filled with the sounds of mourning and ceremony. Okiyo had kept to her own chambers during all of this, understanding that her presence in the main areas of the household would be inappropriate during the family's grief. She had offered her condolences through a note to Lady Sakai, properly worded and conveying appropriate sentiment. She had ensured that Takamaru understood the gravity of what had occurred and behaved with proper solemnity. But even as she performed these correct actions, she had begun to understand what Yoshitaka's death meant. The second son, Masaki, was now the heir apparent. But Masaki was only 12 years old, and he had always been the spare rather than the primary. If anything happened to him, illness, accident, any of the 100 misfortunes that could strike a child, the question of succession would become complicated. Lord Sakai was 48 years old, still healthy but not young. If he died without a clear heir of appropriate age, the shogunate would become involved in determining succession. Relatives would assert competing claims. The domain's stability would be threatened. And in such circumstances, an 8-year-old son of a concubine, healthy and clearly the Lord's child, might suddenly become relevant to discussions of power and inheritance in ways that would make everyone in the household recalculate their positions. Okiyo had recognized these possibilities immediately, and she had known that everyone else in the household would recognize them too. The dynamics that had governed 5 years of her life, the careful stability, the defined hierarchies, the predictable routines, had become suddenly unstable. And now, this morning, the main wife had bowed to her. The gesture was brief and shallow, nothing that would be remarkable in most contexts. But in the precise world of hierarchies and positions that define this household, it was extraordinary. It acknowledged that Okiyo's position had transformed, that the concubine, who had been properly subordinate for 5 years, now occupied space in the household's power structures that required different treatment. Lady Sakai straightened from her bow and gestured to a cushion. "Please sit, Okiyo-san." Not Okiyo, as she had been addressed before, but Okiyo-san with the suffix that denoted respect. Another shift, another signal that the rules had changed. Okiyo entered the room and knelt on the indicated cushion, her movements careful and controlled. Around her, the serving women maintained their positions along the walls, witnesses to whatever would happen next. The morning light filtered through the shoji screens, illuminating dust motes in the air. From somewhere in the mansion, she could hear the distant sound of servants beginning their daily work. Life continued, but the structure that had organized that life had fractured in ways that would reshape everything that followed. Lady Sakai knelt on her own cushion, her face composed but her eyes showing the exhaustion of grief and sleepless nights. Between them lay all the complicated questions of succession, power, loyalty and survival that Yoshitaka's death had brought into sudden focus. "We must speak about your son," Lady Sakai said quietly, "and about what his future may hold." The system of concubinage in Edo period Japan was both formally recognized and carefully regulated, particularly within daimyo households, where questions of lineage and succession carried enormous political weight. Unlike casual sexual relationships or temporary liaisons, formal concubinage involves specific legal status, defined rights and obligations, and clear protocols for how all parties should conduct themselves. For elite families, concubines served multiple purposes beyond the lord's personal satisfaction. They provided insurance against the possibility that the legitimate wife might not bear sons, or that legitimate sons might die before reaching maturity. They created additional connections to other families, as concubines were often selected from samurai households whose loyalty the daimyo wished to secure. They demonstrated the lord's power and status. Maintaining a household with multiple women was a privilege of high rank, and they generated children who, while ranking below legitimate offspring, could be useful for creating marriage alliances with other families or filling retainer positions. The position of formal concubine, sokushitsu or mekake, was distinct from that of wife in essential ways. A wife was selected through formal marriage negotiations between families, her union marked by elaborate ceremonies and the exchange of substantial gifts. Her position was permanent and could not be easily dissolved. Her children were legitimate and had primary claims to inheritance. She had authority within the household to manage servants and make decisions about domestic matters. She represented her husband's house to the outside world and bore responsibility for maintaining its dignity and reputation. A concubine, by contrast, was acquired through private negotiation, often through intermediaries or marriage brokers. While her position might be formalised through written agreements and the payment of compensation to her family, there were no public ceremonies marking her arrival. Her status was revocable. A lord could dismiss a concubine, though doing so to a woman of samurai background required care to avoid dishonouring her family. Her children were recognised as the lord's offspring but ranked below legitimate children. She had no authority within the household beyond her own chambers and her own servants. She existed in a space that was neither servant nor family, defined by her connection to the lord but subordinate to his legitimate wife in all circumstances. The hierarchies within a daimyo household were complex and carefully maintained. At the top stood the lord himself, wielding absolute authority over all aspects of the domain and the household. Immediately below him ranked his legitimate wife, who held the title of lady and commanded respect from everyone except her husband. Legitimate children followed, with the heir apparent holding the highest position among them. Below legitimate children came various relatives, the lord's siblings, his mother if she still lived, unmarried sisters or aunts who resided in the household. Concubines occupied an ambiguous space in this hierarchy. They ranked above servants and above most distant relatives, but they ranked below all legitimate family members, and they had no authority that was not derived directly from the lord's favour. Their position was always provisional, always dependent on continued regard. Within the population of concubines themselves, further hierarchies existed. The first concubine, or the concubine who had borne sons, typically held higher status than more recent additions, or women who had borne only daughters or no children at all. But these rankings were informal and could shift based on the lord's preferences or changes in political circumstances. The daily life of a concubine in a daimyo household was structured by these hierarchies and by the need to avoid disruption to the household's harmony. Concubines maintained their own quarters, usually in wings of the residence that provided proximity to the lord while maintaining separation from the main wife's domain. They had personal serving women assigned to attend them, though fewer than the legitimate wife would command. They received stipends for their maintenance, calculated based on their position and the lord's wealth. A concubine's daily routine typically involved maintaining her chambers and her appearance, cultivating accomplishments like music or poetry that the lord might appreciate, and being available when summoned to the lord's presence. She had no official duties within the household administration, and no authority over servants beyond those directly assigned to her. Her relationship with the lord was private and not discussed openly, even though everyone in the household was aware of it. When she encountered the legitimate wife or legitimate children, she was expected to show appropriate deference through bowing, deferential language, and yielding precedence in all situations. The children of concubines occupied their own complicated position. They were officially recognised as the lord's offspring and registered in domain records, giving them samurai status and the privileges that came with it. But they ranked definitively below legitimate children in all matters of inheritance and succession. A concubine's son might be educated alongside legitimate sons, but his future prospects were different. He would not inherit the domain unless all legitimate sons died, and circumstances made him the only viable candidate. a situation that created exactly the kind of political complexity that everyone tried to avoid. More typically, concubine sons were found positions as retainers in the domain's administration, married into other samurai families of respectable, but not elite rank, or adopted into households that needed heirs. Concubines' daughters were married to samurai families, their connections to a daimyo making them valuable alliance partners, even though their mother's status complicated their prospects. These children grew up knowing they were the Lord's offspring, but also knowing that their futures would always be constrained by their mother's positions. The relationship between a legitimate wife and her husband's concubines was governed by strict protocols designed to minimize conflict and preserve harmony. The wife was expected to tolerate concubinage as a normal feature of elite households, maintaining dignity and not displaying jealousy or resentment. The concubines were expected to show the wife absolute deference and to never challenge her authority or prestige. Face-to-face encounters were kept to a minimum, usually occurring only during major household ceremonies or when circumstances required coordination. Behind this formal correctness, the actual emotions were complex and various. Some wives maintained genuinely friendly relationships with concubines, particularly if they had confidence in their own positions and felt no threat. Others harboured deep resentment while maintaining impeccable surface courtesy. Much depended on the individuals involved, the specific circumstances of the household, and the Lord's behaviour toward all parties. For concubines, the primary strategy for survival and security was to avoid causing any disruption that might give the legitimate wife reason to request their dismissal. A smart concubine cultivated a reputation for discretion, maintained proper behaviour at all times, and never presumed beyond her defined position. She understood that her security depended entirely on not becoming a problem. The most dangerous situations for concubines arose when questions of succession became uncertain. If legitimate sons died or proved unsuitable, and if a concubine son became relevant to inheritance discussions, the dynamics that had maintained household stability could collapse rapidly. A concubine son who might inherit represented a threat to the legitimate wife's children and her own position. The Lord's advisors and relatives might divide into factions supporting different candidates. The shogunate might become involved, as succession disputes in daimyo families could threaten regional stability. In such circumstances, a concubine and her son might find themselves at the centre of dangerous political calculations. Supporters might seek to elevate the son's position to advance their own interests. Opponents might seek to eliminate him, either through formal processes or through more direct means. The concubine herself might be pressured to support various schemes or alliances, or might be seen as dangerous simply because of her son's potential relevance. These were the circumstances that Okiyo now faced. Yoshitaka's death had transformed her son from a comfortable irrelevance into a potential heir. Everyone in the household would be reassessing their positions and their strategies. Lady Sakai would be calculating how to protect her surviving son Masaki's claim to succession. Lord Sakai's advisors would be considering various scenarios and contingencies. Relatives who had their own interests in the domain's future would be forming opinions about which candidate they might support if the question became open. And Okiyo, who had spent 5 years maintaining careful invisibility and perfect subordination, now sat in the main wife's chambers receiving a bow she should never have received, about to have a conversation that would determine whether her son's sudden relevance meant opportunity or mortal danger. Lady Sakai poured tea herself rather than allowing a serving woman to perform the task. This too was significant, a gesture of respect that acknowledged the new relationship between them, however temporary it might prove. "I will speak frankly," Lady Sakai said, her voice low enough that the serving women along the walls would struggle to hear clearly. "My son Masaki is now heir to the domain. He is 12 years old, healthy, and being educated appropriately for his future responsibilities. If all proceeds as it should, he will inherit when Lord Sakai passes, however many years from now that may be." Okiyo nodded, accepting the teacup that was offered. She said nothing, waiting for whatever would come next. However, Lady Sakai continued, her face carefully composed, we both understand that life is uncertain. My eldest son was healthy 3 days ago. Now he is dead. No mother can look at her surviving children without remembering how quickly circumstances can change. I am deeply sorry for your loss, Okiyo said quietly. The words were formal but sincere. Whatever complicated feelings existed between them, Yoshitaka's death was a genuine tragedy. Thank you. Lady Sakai set down her own teacup without drinking. If anything were to happen to Masaki, which the gods forbid, the question of succession would become complicated. Lord Sakai is 48 years old. He might have another legitimate son, but there is no guarantee, and time is not unlimited. In such circumstances, your son would become relevant to discussions about the domain's future. There it was, spoken openly. Okiyo felt her chest tighten with awareness of the danger in this moment. Takamaru is 8 years old, Okiyo said carefully. He is a concubine's son. Surely there are other options that would be considered before. There are, Lady Sakai interrupted. Lord Sakai has 2 younger brothers, both of whom have sons. There are cousins in branch families. The shogunate could impose a candidate if they deem the situation unstable. But your son is Lord Sakai's child, raised in this household, known to the retainers. In certain circumstances he might be seen as the most straightforward choice, despite his mother's status. Okiyo forced herself to breathe steadily. Why are you telling me this? Because we need to understand each other. Lady Sakai leaned forward slightly. There are people in this domain who would see advantage in uncertainty about succession. There are retainers who have grievances with Lord Sakai's administration, relatives who believe they deserve more influence, advisors who might prefer a child lord they could control rather than Masaki, who is old enough to have opinions of his own. And you believe these people would support Takamaru? I believe they might try to use Takamaru. Lady Sakai's voice was quiet but intense. A concubine's son, young enough to be influenced, without powerful family connections of his own. He would be useful to certain ambitions, and if something were to happen to Masaki, these people would have an opening to act. The implication hung in the air between them. Okiyo felt cold despite the warm morning. You think someone might harm your son in order to create that opening? I think my son is now in danger from people I cannot fully identify or control, and I think your son is also in danger, though perhaps you have not yet realized it. What do you mean? Lady Sakai picked up her teacup again, turning it in her hands. If Takamaru exists, he is a tool that can be used. If he does not exist, the succession becomes clearer. There are those who might prefer the second option. Okiyo's throat felt tight. She had understood that Takamaru's position had changed, but she had not fully considered that his sudden relevance might make him a target rather than an opportunity. A child who might inherit was valuable, but a child who complicated inheritance was an obstacle. What do you propose? Okiyo asked, her voice barely above a whisper. An alliance, Lady Sakai said simply. Between you and me, we both have sons whose safety we must protect. We both have reason to prefer stability over uncertainty. If we work together, we have a better chance of protecting both boys and preserving the succession as it should be. Okiyo looked at the woman who'd been distant and cold to her for 5 years. Lady Sakai's face showed the exhaustion of grief, but also a hardness born of understanding what was at stake. She had lost one son already. She would do whatever was necessary to protect the child who remained. What would this alliance require of me? Okiyo asked. Several things. First, you must make clear to anyone who approaches you that you support Masaki's claim to succession without reservation. You must not allow anyone to use your son as a symbol of alternative possibilities. Second, you must help me identify which retainers and relatives are discussing succession in ways that might threaten either of our sons. Your position in this household has made you invisible in certain ways. People may speak more freely around you than they would around me. Third, you must trust that I will protect Takamaru's future interests, even as I protect Masaki's succession. And what do I receive in return? My protection of your son's position in this household. my support for his future prospects, a good position in the domain's administration when he comes of age, or an advantageous marriage alliance, and my cooperation in keeping him safe from those who might see him as an obstacle rather than an asset. Okiyo sat with this proposal, turning it over in her mind. She understood what Lady Sakai was offering, a partnership born of necessity, between two women whose sons' lives had become entangled in dangerous political calculations. But she also understood what was being asked, that she actively work to ensure her own son would never inherit, that she use whatever small influence she had to support the legitimate heir, that she trust a woman who had spent 5 years treating her with cold distance. "If I refuse?" Okiyo asked, needing to understand all her options. Lady Sakai's face became very still. "Then we are adversaries rather than allies, and I will do whatever is necessary to protect my son's claim, including removing any obstacles that threaten it." The threat was delicately stated, but absolutely clear. If Okiyo did not cooperate, Lady Sakai would treat Takamaru as a danger to be eliminated, and Lady Sakai commanded resources and authority that Okiyo could never match. "I understand," Okiyo said quietly. "Do you accept?" Okiyo looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. She thought about Takamaru, 8 years old and bright and full of life, unaware that his existence had become a political problem. She thought about the fragile security she had built over 5 years, now revealed as even more precarious than she had understood. She thought about the choice being offered, cooperation that might protect her son, or refusal that would make him a target. "I accept," she said. Lady Sakai's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good. Then we begin immediately." She gestured to one of the serving women, who approached and knelt beside her. "Bring my writing materials." As the woman departed to fetch what was needed, Lady Sakai turned back to Okiyo. "We will compose a letter together, addressed to Lord Sakai. It will express your complete support for Masaki as heir, and your desire that Takamaru be educated to serve his older brother loyally when Masaki inherits. This letter will be shown to senior retainers, making your position public and clear. That will make it impossible for anyone to approach me about alternative arrangements," Okiyo said, understanding the strategy. "Exactly. You will become useless to any schemes that involve using Takamaru as a rival claimant, and that will make both you and your son safer." The serving woman returned with brushes, ink and paper. Lady Sakai prepared the materials with practiced movements, then looked at Okiyo expectantly. "You have elegant calligraphy, I'm told. You should write it, in your own hand. That will make it more personal and therefore more convincing." Okiyo moved to kneel beside the low writing table. She picked up the brush, feeling its familiar weight, and began to compose the letter that would define her son's future. As she wrote, carefully forming each character with all the skill she had learned years ago, she was aware of Lady Sakai watching her, and of the serving women witnessing this moment, and of the morning light continuing to brighten beyond the shoji screens. 3 days ago, her son had been irrelevant to the household power structures. Now she was writing a letter publicly declaring he would never inherit, and she was doing so to keep him alive. The brush moved across the paper, creating permanent marks that could not be retracted or altered. With each character, Okiyo was choosing her son's survival over any possibility of his elevation. She was accepting permanent subordination in exchange for protection. She was making an alliance with a woman who had been distant and cold, trusting that this woman would honour an agreement born of shared desperation rather than mutual regard. When the letter was finished, she set down the brush and looked at what she'd written. The characters were beautiful, precise, and elegant. The words were simple and clear. She expressed her grief at Yoshitaka's death. She acknowledged Masaki as the rightful heir. She stated her wish that Takamaru would serve his older brother with loyalty and dedication. She pledged her own support to the proper succession. Lady Sakai read the letter carefully, then nodded. "It is well written. It says exactly what needs to be said." She allowed the ink to dry, then folded the letter with careful movements. "I will present this to Lord Sakai this evening. He will be pleased, I think. and reassured. The question of your loyalty has been on his mind, though he has not spoken of it directly. "Thank you for the warning about the threats we face," Okiyo said, rising from the writing table and returning to her cushion. "We will need to communicate regularly now," Lady Sakai said. "Not publicly, but through trusted intermediaries. You will inform me of anything you observe or hear that might be relevant to our son's safety. I will inform you of any decisions or changes that might affect your position." "I understand." Lady Sakai stood, signalling that the meeting was ending. Okiyo rose as well, and for a moment they faced each other. Two women who had spent 5 years maintaining careful distance, now bound together by the dangerous politics of succession and the shared need to protect their children. "One more thing," Lady Sakai said. "You should limit Takamaru's movements outside your chambers for the next several weeks. Keep him close, where he can be watched by servants we trust. Until we better understand who might wish him harm, we must assume everyone is potentially dangerous." The words chilled Okiyo. Her son, whose existence had become a problem to be managed, would now need to be guarded like a prisoner in his own home. "I will do as you suggest," Okiyo said. She bowed, a deep, respectful bow that acknowledged Lady Sakai's authority and her own subordination. Lady Sakai returned the bow with another of those small, brief gestures that were so inappropriate to their respective ranks, and therefore so significant in marking the change that had occurred. Okiyo turned and left the chambers, walking back through the corridors toward the west wing. Serving women she passed looked at her with curious eyes, wondering what had transpired in that meeting, already beginning to spread word that something extraordinary was happening. By evening, everyone in the household would know that the main wife had summoned the concubine, that they had spoken privately for some time, that a letter had been written. The speculation would be intense and varied. Some would guess correctly about the alliance being formed. Others would invent elaborate theories about conflicts and schemes. The household would buzz with gossip and rumour, as it always did when the usual patterns were disrupted. When Okiyo reached her chambers, she found Takamaru playing with wooden blocks under Yuki's watchful supervision. He looked up when his mother entered, his face brightening with a smile. "Mother, look what I built." He'd constructed an elaborate structure from the blocks, a castle with walls and gates carefully balanced and precisely arranged. She looked at his creation and felt her chest tighten with love and fear in equal measure. "It's very fine," she said, kneeling beside him. He began to explain the various features of his block castle, pointing out where the guards would stand and where the lord would have his chambers. His enthusiasm was pure and uncomplicated. He had no idea that his own existence had become a political problem, that decisions were being made about his future without his knowledge or consent, that his mother had just written a letter ensuring he would never inherit the position his block castle represented. She let him talk, listening to his child's voice and watching his small hands gesture as he described his imaginary domain. Yuki caught her eye over the boy's head, her expression questioning. Okiyo gave a small nod, indicating that everything was as well as could be expected, and Yuki's face relaxed slightly. When Takamaru finished explaining his castle, Okiyo drew him close and held him, feeling the solid warmth of his small body against hers. He tolerated this for a moment, then wriggled free, wanting to continue his play. "Mother, you're crushing my castle," he protested, laughing. "I am sorry," she said, releasing him. "I will be more careful." She watched him rebuild the parts of his structure that she had disturbed, his face serious and intent on the task. The morning light continued to brighten, filling her chambers with the soft glow that made everything seem peaceful and secure. But she knew better now. She understood how quickly apparent security could dissolve, how vulnerable even the children of powerful men could be, how dangerous it was to occupy space in the marginal areas between safety and threat. She had spent 5 years trying to be invisible, to cause no disruption, to remain safely peripheral to the household's power structures. Now, through no action of her own, she and her son had been drawn into the centre of those structures, their safety dependent on alliances and calculations and the willingness of others to protect them. The letter she had written would be delivered to Lord Sakai this evening. By tomorrow, senior retainers would have seen it and understood its implications. Within days, everyone who mattered in the domain would know where she stood and what she supported. She had chosen survival over possibility, protection over ambition. She had made an alliance with a woman who had reason to see her son as a threat, trusting that shared danger created shared interest. She had written words that could not be unwritten, taken a position from which she could not retreat. And now she would need to live with those choices and do whatever was necessary to keep her son safe in a household where his very existence had become a problem that needed to be managed. The change in the household's atmosphere was immediate and palpable. By the evening of the day Okiyo had met with Lady Sakai, word had spread that something significant had occurred. Servants who had barely acknowledged Okiyo's presence now watched her with open curiosity. Retainers who passed her in the corridors offered deeper bows than they had before. The second concubine, Fumiko, sent a message requesting a meeting, clearly anxious to understand what had happened and how it might affect her own position. Okiyo received Fumiko in her chambers the following afternoon. The younger woman entered with obvious nervousness, kneeling and bowing more deeply than usual. Her youth and uncertainty were evident in every movement. "Thank you for seeing me, Okiyo-san," Fumiko said, using the respectful suffix without prompting. "Of course," Okiyo replied, gesturing for her to sit. "Would you like tea?" As Yuki prepared and served tea, Okiyo observed Fumiko carefully. The young woman was 20 years old now, had been in the household for less than a year, and had not yet borne children. Her position was even more precarious than Okiyo's had ever been. She had no son to give her status, no years of establishment to provide security, only her youth and beauty and her father's commercial connections. "Everyone is talking about your meeting with Lady Sakai," Fumiko said once they were alone with their tea. "They say it lasted more than an hour. They say you wrote a letter together. They say." She trailed off, uncertain how to continue. "They say many things," Okiyo finished, "much of it speculation and rumour. Is it true that you have formed an alliance with the lady?" Okiyo considered how much to reveal. She had no obligation to explain anything to Fumiko, but the younger woman's question was reasonable, and her anxiety was justified. The death of the heir apparent and the shifting dynamics it had created affected everyone in the household, including those in the most vulnerable positions. "Lady Sakai and I had a conversation about our son's futures," Okiyo said carefully. "We came to an understanding about how to ensure stability for the household and the domain. And what does that mean for the rest of us? It means that the succession is clear and will be protected. Masaki will inherit when the time comes. No one should have any uncertainty about that." Fumiko absorbed this, her face showing relief mixed with continued uncertainty. "And your son? Takamaru will be educated to serve his older brother loyally. That is his path forward, and I support it completely." "I see." Fumiko set down her teacup. "I have been receiving visitors in the past few days. Retainers who come ostensibly to pay respects, but who ask indirect questions about my views on the household's future, about whether I think the succession is settled, about whether I have concerns that need to be addressed." Okiyo felt a spike of alertness. This was exactly the kind of information Lady Sakai had asked her to gather. "What have you told them?" "That I am new to the household and have no views on such elevated matters. That I trust Lord Sakai and Lady Sakai to manage the domain's future as they see fit. That I occupy a position of no consequence in these important questions." "That is the correct response," Okiyo said. "If anyone presses you further, you should inform Lady Sakai through her serving women. These questions are not innocent curiosity. They are attempts to identify potential allies for various schemes." Fumiko's eyes widened. "You think there are schemes? To do what?" "To create uncertainty where there should be clarity. To advance interests that might not align with the household's stability. We must all be careful about who we trust and what we say." "I understand." Fumiko paused, then asked the question that clearly troubled her most. "Am I in danger?" Okiyo considered this seriously. Fumiko had no children, no established position, and connections through her father that were commercial rather than political. She was unlikely to be useful to anyone plotting around succession, which meant she was probably not a target, but her very vulnerability made her potentially manipulable. "You're in danger of being used," Okiyo said finally. "People may try to convince you that your interests lie in supporting alternatives to the established succession. They may offer you promises or incentives. You must understand that any such offers are traps. Your safety lies in maintaining complete neutrality and deference to Lady Sakai's authority." "Thank you for the warning," Fumiko bowed her head. "May I ask you something else?" "You may ask. How did you know what to do? When Lady Sakai summoned you, how did you know the right responses? I feel like I understand nothing of what is happening, and every choice I make might be wrong." Okiyo looked at the younger woman and remembered her own arrival in this household 5 years ago. She had been older than Fumiko, more educated, but equally uncertain about how to navigate the complex hierarchies and unspoken rules. She had learned through observation, through careful attention to how others behaved, through small mistakes that taught her the boundaries of her position. "You survive by understanding your place and never trying to exceed it," Okiyo said. "You're not family. You're not important to succession. You're not involved in politics. These facts are not insults. They are protections. As long as you remain unimportant, you remain safe. The moment you try to become more than what you are, you become dangerous to others, and therefore a target." "Is that what happened to you? Did you try to become more?" "No, I never tried. But my son's existence made me relevant regardless of my intentions. That is not a situation you face, and you should be grateful for it." Fumiko nodded slowly, absorbing this wisdom. "I will do as you suggest. I will remain unimportant." "Good." Okiyo poured more tea for both of them. "If anyone approaches you with questions or offers, you will inform me immediately. I will pass the information to Lady Sakai. That is how you protect yourself, by being forthcoming about attempts to involve you in things that do not concern you." "I will do that." Fumiko hesitated, then added, "Thank you, Okiyo-san, for explaining these things. I have been very frightened since the young lord died." "We are all frightened," Okiyo said. "Fear is appropriate. It keeps us careful." After Fumiko left, Okiyo sat alone in her chambers, thinking about the conversation. She had learned something useful, that retainers were actively seeking to identify who in the household might support alternative succession arrangements. This information needed to be passed to Lady Sakai, but it also raised questions about who these retainers were, what they wanted, and how far they might be willing to go to achieve their goals. She decided to compose a careful note to Lady Sakai detailing what Fumiko had reported. She would send it through Yuki, who had agreed to serve as a secure intermediary between the two women. As she wrote, she heard Takamaru in the next room practicing his calligraphy under Yuki's supervision. His young voice counted brushstrokes aloud, careful and focused on the task. He had adjusted to the new restrictions on his movements without complaint, accepting his mother's explanation that he needed to stay close to their chambers because of household mourning protocols. He did not understand that he was being protected, that his movements were limited not out of respect for the dead heir, but out of fear for his own safety. She finished the note and sealed it, then called Yuki over and gave her quiet instructions about its delivery. Yuki nodded her understanding and tucked the note into her clothing, ready to pass it to one of Lady Sakai's trusted serving women when opportunity allowed. The days that followed established new patterns. Okiyo spent her time in her chambers, or in the small private garden, rarely venturing into other parts of the mansion. Takamaru continued his lessons under supervision, his world now confined to the spaces Okiyo deemed safe. The household continued its routines around them. Servants worked, meals were prepared and served. The slow processes of mourning for Yoshitaka proceeded through their prescribed stages. But beneath this surface normalcy, Okiyo began to notice small signs of tension and division. Retainers who had always been cordial to each other now showed subtle coldness. Senior advisors who typically acted in concert seemed to be forming separate factions. Conversations would cease abruptly when certain people entered rooms. Servants who had served the household for years suddenly requested transfers to other positions. She noted these observations and passed them along to Lady Sakai through their network of trusted intermediaries. In return, she received information about developments she could not observe directly. That Lord Sakai had met extensively with his senior advisors about strengthening Masaki's claim to succession, that letters had been sent to the shogunate formally notifying them of Yoshitaka's death and Masaki's elevation to heir apparent, that relatives in branch families were being assessed for their loyalty and reliability. The letter Okiyo had written in Lady Sakai's chambers had been circulated widely among the domain's leadership. It had been received exactly as intended, as a clear statement that Takamaru's mother supported the legitimate succession and would not be party to any alternative arrangements. This had eliminated one possible source of instability, but it had also made clear to anyone who might have had other plans that they would need to proceed without Okiyo's cooperation or consent. 3 weeks after Yoshitaka's death, Okiyo received a visit from someone unexpected. One of Lord Sakai's younger brothers, Sakai Nobumasa. He was 40 years old and maintained his own household in the castle town as befitted a daimyo's brother. He had 2 sons of his own, both teenagers, and had always been cordial if distant in his interactions with Okiyo on the rare occasions when they had encountered each other. He appeared at her chambers in the late afternoon, announced by a nervous serving woman who clearly understood that this visit was unusual. Okiyo received him with proper courtesy, directing Yuki to bring tea and seating him at an appropriate distance in her main room. "Thank you for receiving me, Okiyo-san," Nobumasa said, his manner formal and correct. "I know this visit is irregular, but I hoped we might speak privately about matters of mutual concern." Okiyo felt immediate wariness. A visit from the Lord's brother, coming to her chambers rather than summoning her to his household, speaking of mutual concerns. All of this suggested exactly the kind of approach Lady Sakai had warned her about. "I am honoured by your visit, Lord Nobumasa," she said, keeping her voice neutral, "though I am uncertain what matters of mutual concern might exist between us." "Your son's future, for one thing," Nobumasa said directly, "and the domain's stability for another. My son's future is clear. He will be educated to serve his older brother when Masaki-sama inherits the domain." "Yes, I read the letter you composed with Lady Sakai. It was diplomatic." Nobumasa sipped his tea, his eyes studying her carefully. "But I wonder if you fully understand what you committed yourself to in writing that letter." "I understand completely. I committed to supporting the legitimate succession. You committed to ensuring your son will never inherit regardless of circumstances. You eliminated him as a possibility from succession discussions. That was perhaps premature." Okiyo kept her face carefully neutral, though her heart was beating faster. This was exactly the kind of conversation she'd been warned about, exactly the kind of approach she needed to report to Lady Sakai. "With respect, Lord Nobumasa, my son was never a legitimate possibility for succession. He is a concubine's child. His position has always been clear. Positions can change. Circumstances can change. 3 weeks ago, Yoshitaka was the heir apparent. Now he is dead, and Masaki is heir apparent. But Masaki is 12 years old. If something were to happen to him..." Nobumasa paused meaningfully. "The gods forbid such a tragedy," Okiyo said. "Indeed. But we must plan for all eventualities. If something were to happen to Masaki, the question of succession would be open. Your son might be considered, despite his mother's status. Unless, of course, you have already eliminated that possibility by declaring him unfit for consideration." "I have declared him loyal to his older brother. That is not the same as declaring him unfit." "Perhaps not. But it creates complications. If circumstances made your son the best candidate for succession, your letter would be cited as evidence against his suitability. You have damaged his prospects in order to curry favour with Lady Sakai." Okiyo took a slow breath, choosing her words with extreme care. "I have no interest in currying favour. I have interest in supporting the legitimate succession and ensuring the domain's stability. These interests coincide with Lady Sakai's, which is why we are in agreement." "Are you sure your interests coincide with hers?" Nobumasa leaned forward slightly. "Lady Sakai is protecting her own son. That is natural and expected, but in doing so she is asking you to surrender any possibility of advantage for your son. She benefits from your cooperation, but what do you gain?" "I gain protection for my son's life and future prospects." "From what? From whom?" "Lady Sakai has convinced you that you and your son are in danger, but perhaps the danger comes from her. Perhaps she is the one who sees Takamaru as a threat to be eliminated." The suggestion was subtle but clear, that Lady Sakai might harm Takamaru to secure Masaki's succession, that the alliance Okiyo had formed was actually exposing her son to the very person most threatened by his existence. "I do not believe Lady Sakai would harm a child," Okiyo said firmly. "That would be dishonourable and would bring dishonour to her house. Honour does not always govern actions when power is at stake. I am simply suggesting that you should think very carefully about whom you trust. Lady Sakai has her own interests. They may not always align with yours." "And your interests, Lord Nobumasa, do they align with mine?" "They might. I have 2 sons of my own. If Masaki were to prove unsuitable for succession, my older son could be considered. But I would prefer a candidate who is actually my brother's child, who carries his blood and represents true continuity. Your son fits that description." There it was, stated openly. Nobumasa was proposing an alternative to the established succession, with himself as kingmaker and Takamaru as puppet heir. If Nobumasa succeeded in elevating Takamaru, he would effectively control the domain through his young nephew, advancing his own interests while claiming to serve his brother's bloodline. Okiyo understood immediately how dangerous this conversation had become. Nobumasa was testing her, seeing whether she could be recruited to support his faction. Every word she spoke now would be remembered and potentially used against her. "I appreciate your concerns for my son's welfare," Okiyo said carefully, "but I must tell you that my position is unchangeable. I support Masaki-sama's succession completely. I have no interest in alternative arrangements, and I will inform Lady Sakai of this conversation, as she has asked me to report any approaches of this nature." Nobumasa's face hardened slightly. "You're making a mistake. Lady Sakai's position is not as secure as you believe. There are many in this domain who have concerns about a child lord, who would prefer a candidate who could be influenced by experienced advisors. If you align yourself too closely with Lady Sakai, you may find yourself on the wrong side of important decisions. That is a risk I accept. Think carefully before you commit yourself irrevocably. Opportunities to change course become fewer as positions harden. I'm offering you a chance to consider alternatives while such consideration is still possible. Once events proceed to certain points, choices become fixed." "I understand what you are offering, Lord Nobumasa, and I am declining. I will support the legitimate succession. That is my position, and it will not change." Nobumasa set down his teacup with deliberate care. He rose, and Okiyo rose as well, maintaining the appropriate formal postures. "I am disappointed," he said, "but I understand that you have made your choice. I hope you do not come to regret it." The warning in his words was unmistakable. Okiyo bowed correctly, and he returned the bow before departing. After he left, she remained standing in her main room, her mind racing. She had just been approached exactly as Lady Sakai had predicted. She had been offered an alternative to the established succession, and she had declined, making clear where her loyalty lay. But in doing so, she had also made an enemy of a powerful man who had his own ambitions and his own resources. She needed to inform Lady Sakai immediately. This conversation was evidence of active plotting around succession, proof that factions were forming and approaches were being made. It was exactly the kind of information their alliance was meant to generate and share. She called for Yuki and composed a detailed account of Nobumasa's visit, recording as precisely as possible what had been said and what had been implied. She sealed the note and sent it through their secure channel to Lady Sakai's chambers. Then she went to the room where Takamaru was still practicing his calligraphy and watched her son form characters with careful attention, his small hand gripping the brush with determination. He looked up when she entered and smiled. "Mother, look! I wrote all 30 characters without making any mistakes." She came to kneel beside him, examining his work. The characters were well formed for a child his age, showing the benefits of careful instruction and natural aptitude. She praised his accomplishment, and he beamed with pride. But as she looked at his innocent face and his careful work, she thought about what Nobumasa had proposed, using this child as a puppet heir, elevating him to power he could not wield, making him the centre of factional conflicts that could tear the domain apart. And she thought about what she had just done, rejected that possibility, made an enemy of a powerful man, bet her son's safety on an alliance with a woman who had every reason to see him as a threat. She had been forced to choose between terrible options, and she had chosen the one that seemed least likely to destroy everything. But she could not know if she had chosen correctly. She could only commit to her decision and try to navigate the consequences as they unfolded. That evening she received a response from Lady Sakai, delivered through Yuki. The note was brief. "Your information is valuable. You have acted correctly. Trust that your son is now safer than he was before this conversation occurred. More will be revealed soon." Okiyo read the note, then burned it in the lamp flame as she had been instructed to do with all correspondence from Lady Sakai. The paper curled and blackened, the characters disappearing into ash. More will be revealed soon. She wondered what that meant. What action would Lady Sakai take based on the information Okiyo had provided? How would Nobumasa's faction respond to Okiyo's rejection of their approach? What other dangers were still hidden, waiting to emerge as the struggle over succession continued? She had thought 3 weeks ago that her life as a concubine had been carefully structured and predictable. She had understood her position and her role. But Yoshitaka's death had shattered those structures and revealed that her security had always been more fragile than she had realized. Now she was caught in currents of power and ambition that she could barely understand, making alliances and enemies, protecting her son through choices that might save him or destroy him. She had become important in ways that were dangerous, and she could not return to the safe invisibility she had once occupied. All she could do was move forward, honour her commitments, trust in the woman she had allied with, and try to keep her son alive through whatever came next. The household continued its routines, but beneath the surface of normalcy, tensions escalated. Okiyo found herself increasingly isolated as retainers and servants adjusted their behaviour based on her perceived alliance with Lady Sakai. Some treated her with new respect, recognising that she had the main wife's protection, and therefore represented someone who could not be safely antagonised. Others showed subtle hostility, understanding that she had chosen a side in emerging factional conflicts, and marking her as aligned with interests contrary to their own. Fumiko, the younger concubine, sought Okiyo's company more frequently now, clearly frightened by developments she did not fully understand, and seeking guidance from the only other person in the household who occupied a similar position. Okiyo tried to reassure her while also warning her to maintain strict neutrality, to report any approaches from factions, and to avoid being drawn into schemes that could endanger her. "I feel like a pawn in a game I cannot see," Fumiko confessed one afternoon as they sat together in Okiyo's garden. "Everyone looks at me differently now. I do not know whom to trust." "Trust no one who offers you more than your position warrants," Okiyo advised. "If someone promises you advancement, protection, or advantage beyond what a junior concubine with no children should expect, they are lying. They want to use you, not help you." "Even Lady Sakai?" "Lady Sakai is not offering you advancement. She is offering to leave you alone if you remain irrelevant to succession matters. That is honest and appropriate. Accept it." The exchange reminded Okiyo of how much her understanding of household dynamics had evolved in just 3 weeks. She had been forced to become sophisticated about power and politics in ways that her previous 5 years of quiet subordination had never required. The skills she was developing, reading motivations, assessing threats, navigating alliances, were not ones she had wanted to learn, but survival required them. 4 weeks after Yoshitaka's death, Lord Sakai called a formal meeting of the household's senior retainers and his immediate family. The meeting was held in the main reception hall, a space used only for important announcements and ceremonies. Okiyo was not included in the gathering, but she learned of its contents afterward through Lady Sakai's messages. Lord Sakai had used the meeting to make his position absolutely clear. Masaki was his heir, chosen and confirmed. The shogunate had been notified and had acknowledged the succession. Any discussion of alternatives was disloyalty to the domain and to Lord Sakai himself. Retainers who could not support this decision should request transfers to other positions immediately, before their continued presence created problems. The message was unambiguous. The time for uncertainty was over. Those who supported the established succession would be rewarded with continued positions and advancement. Those who opposed it would be removed from power, either voluntarily through transfer or involuntarily through dismissal. The meeting represented Lady Sakai's influence on Lord Sakai's thinking, Okiyo understood. The Lord had been pushed to take a firm public stand earlier than he might have otherwise, specifically to cut off developing factions before they became entrenched. It was a bold move, but also a risky one. Forcing people to choose sides openly could solidify opposition rather than suppressing it. In the days following the meeting, 3 senior retainers requested transfers to other domains, citing family reasons or health concerns, but clearly leaving because they could not support the established succession in good conscience. Their departures created openings in the administration that were filled with retainers known to be loyal to Lady Sakai's interests. Nobumasa attended the meeting and publicly declared his support for his nephew Masaki's succession. But Okiyo, now attuned to reading between formal statements and public positions, understood that this was strategic compliance rather than genuine commitment. Nobumasa had not abandoned his ambitions. He had simply adjusted his approach, recognizing that open opposition was no longer viable after Lord Sakai's firm statement. A week after the formal meeting, Okiyo was summoned to Lady Sakai's chambers again. When she arrived, she found not just Lady Sakai but also 2 senior serving women she did not recognize. Their presence suggested this would be a meeting of some significance. Lady Sakai gestured for Okiyo to sit, then introduced the 2 women. These are representatives from my father's household. They have travelled from his domain to assist with certain arrangements. The women bowed formally to Okiyo, which was unusual. Serving women from a daimyo household would not normally show such respect to a concubine from another family. What arrangements? Okiyo asked cautiously. Arrangements for Takamaru's future, Lady Sakai said. He is now 8 years old and has received basic education from you and from household tutors. It is time to consider his more formal training and the preparation he will need for his adult role. I was planning to continue his education here in the household, Okiyo said, feeling immediate wariness about where this conversation might lead. That would have been appropriate under normal circumstances, but circumstances are not normal. Your son's presence in this household creates ongoing complications, as we have discussed. His safety would be better assured if he were being educated elsewhere, in a location where he cannot be used as a symbol of alternative possibilities. Okiyo felt her chest tighten. You want to send him away. I want to protect him, and to protect Masaki. As long as they are both in this household, they represent competing possibilities to those who might wish to create instability. If Takamaru is being educated in my father's domain, 2 weeks' travel from here, he cannot be used as an immediate alternative if something were to happen to Masaki. He is 8 years old. He is my son. You are asking me to send him away to live among strangers. I am asking you to send him to my father's household, where he will be treated as a valued relative of the Sakai family, educated by excellent tutors, and protected by my father's considerable resources. My father is a daimyo of 60,000 koku. His household is secure and stable. Takamaru would be safer there than he is here. Okiyo looked at the two serving women from Lady Sakai's father's household. They maintained neutral expressions, but their presence here, their willingness to travel 2 weeks to facilitate this arrangement, showed that this plan had been in development for some time. Lady Sakai had not summoned Okiyo to ask permission. She had summoned her to announce a decision already made. "What if I refuse?" Okiyo asked quietly. "Then you break our alliance. And without that alliance, I cannot guarantee your son's safety in this household. The people who approached you about alternative succession arrangements will try again. Others who have not yet made their positions clear will see opportunity in his presence. Every day he remains here, he is a tool that can be used against the established succession. You promised you would protect him, and I am protecting him. By removing him from the dangerous environment of this household and placing him somewhere he can grow up safely. This is not abandonment. This is practical necessity." Okiyo felt tears threatening but forced them back. She would not show weakness in front of these women, would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But inside she felt like something essential was being torn away. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Until he reaches maturity. Perhaps 10 years. Possibly longer depending on circumstances. 10 years. Takamaru was 8 years old. By the time he returned, he would be a young man, shaped by another household, educated by other teachers, with loyalties and relationships formed far from his mother's influence. May I visit him? Occasionally, but not frequently. Your visits would remind people of his connection to this household and undermine the purpose of his relocation. It is better if he becomes truly separate, truly distant from succession considerations here. What will you tell him? What will I tell him about why he must leave? Tell him that he is being honoured with education in a great daimyo's household. Tell him that this is an opportunity for advancement. Tell him that his mother loves him and wants what is best for his future. All of these things are true. Okiyo sat in silence, struggling with the choice being forced upon her. If she refused, she would be breaking the alliance that was currently protecting both her and Takamaru. Lady Sakai might then treat them as threats rather than allies, with consequences Okiyo could barely imagine. If she agreed, she would be sending her 8-year-old son away to be raised by strangers, losing the daily presence that had been the centre of her life for his entire existence. But was Lady Sakai's proposal really a threat disguised as protection? Or was it genuine protection that required painful sacrifice? Okiyo tried to think clearly through her emotional reaction, tried to assess the situation strategically rather than as a mother-facing separation from her child. Takamaru's presence in the household did create complications. He was a potential alternative heir, and as long as he lived here, factions could form around him, or plans could be made that involved him. Removing him from the household eliminated that possibility, made him irrelevant to immediate succession concerns. And if he were truly in danger from those who saw him as an obstacle, distance might indeed provide safety. Lady Sakai's father's household was secure and established. Takamaru would not be living in poverty or uncertainty. He would receive excellent education, probably better than what could be provided in Lord Sakai's household, where his ambiguous status complicated his instruction. He would grow up among other young men of samurai status, form relationships that might serve him well in his adult life. And 10 years was not forever. When he returned as a young man, he would still know who his mother was, would still have some connection to her, even if the bond had been attenuated by distance and time. Will he be told the real reason he's being sent away, Okiyo asked, or will he believe he's simply being honoured with education elsewhere? He will be told what is appropriate for his age and understanding. As he matures, he may come to understand more fully the circumstances that required this arrangement. But for now, he need only know that he is going to be educated by excellent teachers in a great household. Okiyo thought about Takamaru practicing his calligraphy, building his block castles, asking earnest questions about the world. He was curious and bright and trusting. He would not understand why his mother was sending him away. He might feel abandoned, might believe he had done something wrong, might spend years wondering why she did not want him. But if she kept him here, he might be used as a pawn in succession disputes, might become the centre of dangerous factions, might end up hurt or killed because powerful men saw him as useful or threatening. She was being forced to choose between her immediate emotional need to keep her son close and her longer-term responsibility to ensure his safety and future prospects. Every maternal instinct she possessed urged her to refuse, to keep Takamaru with her regardless of consequences. But everything she had learned about survival in this household told her that protecting someone sometimes meant letting them go. When would he leave? She asked, already knowing that by asking this question she was accepting the arrangement. Within 2 weeks. The weather is good for travel now. Waiting longer creates more opportunity for complications. May I have these days to prepare him? To explain things in my own way? Of course. That would be best. He should hear this from you first, presented as the honour and opportunity it truly is. Okiyo nodded slowly, feeling numb. Then I agree. He will go to your father's household, but I want assurances that he will be well treated, that his education will be thorough, and that I will receive regular reports about his health and progress. All of those assurances I can give you. My father is a principled man. He will treat your son as a valued connection to the Sakai family. The education provided will be excellent, and you will receive reports 4 times per year detailing his development and well-being. Lady Sakai gestured to the 2 serving women from her father's household. These women will remain here until the departure, helping with travel arrangements and ensuring the journey is comfortable. They are experienced in caring for children and will ensure Takamaru arrives safely. The women bowed to Okiyo again, acknowledging her importance to the arrangement even as they prepared to take her son away from her. Is there anything else you need from me? Okiyo asked, her voice flat with suppressed emotion. Only your cooperation in making this transition as smooth as possible. If Takamaru is anxious or resistant, the departure will be more difficult for everyone. Present this to him as something positive, something to be excited about rather than feared. I understand. Lady Sakai's face softened slightly, showing something that might have been sympathy. This is difficult. I understand that. If there were another way to ensure both boys' safety, I would pursue it, but we're constrained by circumstances neither of us created. Sometimes protecting those we love requires sacrifices that feel impossible. Yes, Okiyo said. She rose, bowed formally, and left the chambers before her composure could break. She walked through the corridors back to her own rooms, her mind strangely blank, her body moving through familiar space without conscious direction. When she reached her chambers, she found Takamaru where she had left him, playing with his blocks while Yuki supervised. He looked up when she entered, his face bright with innocent happiness. Mother, I'm building a new castle. This one has a tower. She sat down beside him and watched him arrange his blocks, chattering about architectural features and defensive positions with the serious attention that children bring to imaginary worlds. She let him talk, storing up the sound of his voice, the sight of his animated face, the feeling of his presence beside her. That evening, after he'd eaten dinner and finished his evening lesson and was preparing for bed, she sat with him in the dim light of a single lamp and began to explain that he would be going on a journey. Where? He asked, curious rather than anxious. To the household of a great daimyo who wishes to provide you with excellent education. You will learn from wonderful teachers and meet other boys your age. It will be an adventure. Will you come with me? No, I will stay here. But you will go with kind women who will take care of you, and you will be safe and happy. When will I come back? In several years, when your education is complete. His face began to show confusion and distress. But that is a long time. I do not want to be away from you for years. I know, but sometimes we must do difficult things for important reasons. This education will help you grow into the kind of man your father would be proud of. It will prepare you for opportunities you would not have if you stayed here. But I want to stay with you, he said, his voice small and frightened. She pulled him close, holding him against her chest, feeling his small body tense with worry. I know. I want you to stay too, but this is what must be done. You are strong and brave, and you will do well, and I will think of you every day. He began to cry, quietly at first and then with more intensity. The tears of a child who does not understand why his world is being disrupted and cannot be comforted by explanations about future benefits. She held him and let him cry, offering no false reassurances, simply being present in this moment of necessary grief. Eventually his crying subsided into quiet sniffles. She wiped his face with her sleeve and looked into his eyes, so like his father's eyes, seeing trust and confusion, and the beginning of the hardness that would come from learning that even mothers cannot always protect their children from necessary pain. "I need you to be brave," she said quietly. "I need you to go on this journey and work hard at your studies and grow into a fine young man. Can you do that for me?" He nodded, not because he understood or agreed, but because he was a child who trusted his mother's judgment even when it caused him pain. "Good. Then we will have wonderful days together before you leave, and you will carry my love with you wherever you go." She stayed with him until he fell asleep, his face still damp with tears, his small hand clutching hers even in sleep. Then she returned to her own sleeping area and allowed herself to weep silently into her pillow, muffling the sound so that no one would hear. She had agreed to send her son away. She had accepted Lady Sakai's proposal because she believed it would keep him safe. But the pain of that choice felt unbearable, and she wondered if she would ever forgive herself for making it, even if it proved to have been the right decision. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange haze of compressed time and heightened awareness. She spent every possible moment with Takamaru, teaching him things she wanted him to remember, telling him stories about his grandfather's service at Sekigahara, showing him how to write her name so he would not forget it during the years of separation. He adjusted to the idea of departure with the resilience of childhood, his initial distress transforming into excitement about the journey and curiosity about the new household he would join. She was grateful for his adaptability, even as it hurt to watch him begin to emotionally separate from her, preparing himself unconsciously for the change that would soon occur. The 2 serving women from Lady Sakai's father's household were patient and kind with him, answering his questions about where he would live and what he would learn, gradually becoming familiar presences so that he would have known faces to rely on during the journey. On the day of departure, the household assembled in the front courtyard to see him off. Lord Sakai was present, a rare honour that acknowledged Takamaru's status as his son. He spoke briefly with the boy, telling him to study diligently and bring credit to the Sakai name. Lady Sakai attended as well, maintaining appropriate formality, while also showing the courtesy that marked this as an important occasion. Masaki, the heir apparent, stood beside his mother, a serious 12-year-old boy who had been told about the arrangement and understood its political necessity if not its emotional cost. Fumiko was there too, and even some of the retainers who had served the household for years, all assembled to witness the departure of a concubine's son being sent to receive education in another domain's household. Okiyo knelt and embraced Takamaru one final time, holding him close and whispering in his ear, "Remember that you are my son and your father's son. Remember that you come from people who served with honour. Remember that I love you. Remember." He clung to her for a moment, then stepped back and bowed properly, the gesture of a child who had been taught correct behaviour and was trying very hard to demonstrate it. She bowed in return, deeper than necessary, allowing him to see that she honoured his courage and his obedience. Then he climbed into the palanquin with the 2 serving women, and the bearers lifted it to their shoulders, and the small procession moved through the gate and down the street, heading toward the road that would take him away from Edo, away from his mother, away from everything familiar. She stood in the courtyard and watched until the palanquin disappeared from view, until the sound of footsteps faded into the general noise of the city, until there was nothing left to see or hear that connected her to her son. The assembled household began to disperse, people returning to their duties and routines. Lady Sakai approached and spoke quietly. "You have done a very difficult thing, but you have protected him. Remember that." "I will try," Okiyo said, her voice hollow. "You may feel that you have lost him, but you have given him a chance to grow up safely." That is the greatest gift a mother can give. Okiyo nodded, not trusting herself to speak further. She bowed to Lady Sakai and returned to her chambers, which suddenly felt enormously empty, despite being exactly the same size they had always been. Takamaru's blocks were still arranged in their last configuration, the castle he'd been building before departure. His sleeping area still held the indentation of his small body on the futon. His practice papers with their careful characters were stacked on his writing desk. She sat alone in this space that had been shared and was now solitary, and tried to understand how she had come to this point. 3 months ago she'd been a concubine occupying a stable, if subordinate position, raising her son in quiet security, causing no problems and drawing no particular attention. Now her son was gone, sent away for his own protection, and she had become a key figure in political alliances she had never sought, making choices that felt impossible and living with consequences she could barely comprehend. All because the heir apparent had died of fever, and her son's existence had suddenly become relevant to questions of power and succession. She understood intellectually that she had done what was necessary. She had made the only choice that might keep Takamaru alive and safe. She had sacrificed her immediate happiness for his long-term welfare. But understanding did not ease the pain of his absence, or quiet the maternal voice in her head that told her she had failed in the most fundamental duty of protection, or eliminate the fear that she had been manipulated into giving up the one person who mattered most to her. She sat in the empty chambers and let herself grieve, knowing that tomorrow she would need to compose herself and continue navigating the dangerous world she now inhabited. But for this one day she allowed herself to mourn what she had lost, to acknowledge the magnitude of what had been taken from her, and to recognise that she would never again be the person she had been before this loss occurred. 6 months passed. Summer faded into autumn, autumn into winter. The household settled into new patterns after the disruptions of spring. Masaki continued his education as heir apparent, growing visibly taller, his voice beginning to change, his understanding of his future responsibilities deepening. Lady Sakai maintained her position as the domain's de facto power, behind Lord Sakai's nominal authority, managing factions and alliances with skill that earned grudging respect even from those who opposed her interests. Nobumasa made no further direct approaches to Okiyo, but his presence in the domain remained a source of tension. He had accepted Masaki's succession publicly, but worked subtly to position his own sons for influential posts in the domain's administration, building a network of obligations and relationships that would give him leverage regardless of who eventually inherited. Okiyo received reports about Takamaru 4 times as promised, each letter detailing his health, his studies, his adjustment to the new household. The reports were formal and factual, giving her information but little sense of his emotional state or his day-to-day experience. He was learning classical texts, practicing calligraphy and poetry, receiving instruction in martial arts and strategy. He was healthy and showing aptitude for his studies. He was well liked by his teachers and had made friends among the other boys in the household. Each report should have reassured her. Instead, they highlighted how separate his life had become from hers, how he was developing relationships and experiences she would never share, how he was transforming from the child she had known into someone who would be largely a stranger when they finally reunited years from now. Fumiko, the younger concubine, came to rely on Okiyo for guidance and companionship. With Takamaru gone, Okiyo found herself becoming something like a mentor or older sister to the younger woman, helping her navigate the household's complexities and warning her away from various schemes that periodically surfaced. Their relationship filled some of the emptiness Takamaru's absence had created, though it could never replace the bond between mother and child. In the 12th month, 6 months after Takamaru's departure, an event occurred that validated every difficult choice Okiyo had made. Masaki fell seriously ill with the same fever that had killed his brother. The household was thrown into crisis. Lord Sakai brought in every physician and healer who might offer help. Prayers were offered at temples and shrines. Lady Sakai maintained her composure publicly, while privately facing the possibility that she might lose her second son, leaving her childless. and the succession once again uncertain. For 3 weeks, Masaki's life hung in balance. The fever raged, physicians applied treatments that seemed to have no effect, and the household held its collective breath waiting to see whether the heir apparent would survive. Okiyo watched these developments with a mixture of compassion and dread. She felt genuine sympathy for Lady Sakai's suffering, and genuine hope that Masaki would recover. But she also understood that if Masaki died, all the political calculations that had required Takamaru's removal would reassert themselves with renewed intensity. Her son would once again become relevant to succession questions, but now he was safely distant, unable to be used immediately by any faction. If Masaki died while Takamaru was still in the household, Okiyo thought, the pressure to elevate her son would have been enormous. Factions would have formed immediately around different candidates. Violence might have occurred. Takamaru might have been thrust into a role he was unprepared for, or might have been eliminated by those who saw him as an obstacle to their preferred candidate. But because Takamaru was 2 weeks' journey away, being educated in another daimyo's household, he could not be used in the immediate crisis. If Masaki died, there would be time to make careful decisions about succession, rather than hasty choices driven by convenience or factional pressure. The fever finally broke on the 21st day of Masaki's illness. The boy survived, emerging from the crisis weakened but alive, his succession secure once the immediate danger passed. Lady Sakai, who had maintained perfect composure throughout the ordeal, finally allowed herself to show relief, though she did so privately where only her most trusted serving women witnessed her tears. After Masaki's recovery, Lady Sakai summoned Okiyo to her chambers. They had not met face-to-face since Takamaru's departure, communicating instead through written messages passed by intermediaries. Now, sitting across from each other in the formal space where their alliance had been formed, they assessed where circumstances had brought them. "You understand now why your son needed to be distant," Lady Sakai said without preamble. "Yes," Okiyo agreed. "If he had been here when Masaki fell ill, the situation would have become very complicated. Complicated and dangerous. There are those who would have moved quickly to position your son as an alternative, creating factions and instability. By his absence, that possibility was eliminated. Everyone understood that whatever happened with Masaki, Takamaru was not an immediate option. I am grateful that Masaki survived. As am I." Lady Sakai paused, then continued. "I wanted to tell you something that I could not say 6 months ago, when we were arranging for your son's departure. I wanted to send him away not just to protect him from others, but to protect him from me." Okiyo felt a chill. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if Masaki had died while your son was in this household, I would have faced an unbearable choice. I could have protected your son and supported his succession, honouring our alliance and accepting that my husband's concubine's child would inherit. Or I could have worked to eliminate him as a candidate, removing the obstacle to installing someone else, my husband's brother, or a cousin, or someone else I might influence. You're saying you might have harmed my son if Masaki died. I am saying I do not know what I would have done. The grief of losing both my sons might have driven me to actions I would not have taken in calmer circumstances. By sending Takamaru away, I removed the possibility that I would have to make that choice. I protected him from my own potential worst impulses, driven by grief and fear." Okiyo absorbed this admission. Lady Sakai was confessing that the alliance had been genuine but also precarious, that circumstances could have transformed their cooperation into deadly opposition. By recognizing this possibility and acting to prevent it, she had shown a kind of honour that Okiyo had not fully appreciated before. "Thank you for telling me this," Okiyo said quietly. "I wanted you to understand that your sacrifice was not just political calculation. It was the right choice for reasons beyond immediate succession concerns. Your son is safer away from this household not just because of the factions that might use him, but because of what I myself might have become if circumstances had been different." They sat in silence for a moment. Two women who had formed an alliance of necessity, and had maintained it through difficult circumstances, now acknowledging the fragility and complexity of what they had built together. "What happens now?" Okiyo asked. "Now we continue as we have been. Masaki will complete his education and prepare for eventual succession. Your son will complete his education in my father's household and eventually return as a young man ready for an appropriate position in the domain's administration. The alliance between us remains valuable for ensuring stability and protecting both boys' futures." "Will Takamaru be able to visit, or may I visit him? Perhaps in another year or two, when the succession questions are more settled and his presence would not reignite concerns. For now, it is better that he remains distant and focused on his studies." Okiyo nodded, accepting this limitation even as it pained her. "And my position here? What is my role going forward?" "You remain as you were, a concubine in Lord Sakai's household, occupying your chambers and maintaining yourself appropriately. You also remain as you have become, an ally who helps identify threats and maintain stability. These two roles can coexist. And if Lord Sakai takes another concubine, or if circumstances change in other ways, then we adapt as circumstances require. That is what we have both learned to do." The meeting concluded with formal bows and courtesies that marked both respect and continued alliance. Okiyo returned to her chambers, which had remained empty of children for 6 months, and would remain empty for years to come. Becoming someone she would have to get to know anew when he finally returned. The years that followed established a new normal. Okiyo occupied her position in the household as before, but with subtle differences in how she was treated and how she understood her own role. She was no longer simply a concubine who had borne a son. She had become a political actor in her own right, someone whose loyalty mattered and whose observations carried weight. She continued to meet occasionally with Lady Sakai, sharing information and assessing developments in the household and domain. She mentored Fumiko, who remained the anxious younger concubine dependent on guidance to navigate complexities she struggled to understand. She maintained her chambers and her appearance, performed her duties when Lord Sakai summoned her, and presented an external image of calm stability. But internally, she lived with the constant awareness of her son's absence and the uncertainty about what kind of person he was becoming in the distant household where he was being raised. The quarterly reports continued to arrive, providing basic information but never satisfying her need to know how he truly was, what he thought about, whether he remembered her with love or resentment, or merely as a dim recollection from childhood. When Takamaru had been gone for 2 years, Lord Sakai took a third concubine, a woman named Akiko, who was the daughter of a wealthy merchant newly elevated to samurai status. The pattern repeated, a nervous young woman moving into chambers in the West Wing, uncertain of her position, dependent on others to teach her the unspoken rules. Okiyo found herself once again serving as guide and mentor, passing on the lessons she'd learned about survival in ambiguous positions. "The key is to remain unimportant," she told Akiko during one of their early conversations. "You want to be comfortable but not ambitious, valued but not threatening, present but not prominent. Your safety lies in occupying your defined space without trying to expand it." Akiko listened with the same frightened attention that Fumiko had shown years before, and Okiyo recognized her younger self in both women, naive and uncertain, entering a world whose rules were not written anywhere but whose violations carried severe consequences. Masaki continued to grow into his role as heir apparent. At 16, he began participating in domain administration, attending meetings and learning the practical business of governance. He was serious and competent, lacking his father's natural charisma, but compensating with careful attention to detail and dedication to duty. Lady Sakai clearly felt pride in her surviving son, though she never showed it openly, maintaining the dignified reserve appropriate to her position. Lord Sakai was now 52 years old, still healthy, but beginning to show his age in ways that made everyone aware that succession was not an indefinite future concern but something that might occur within a decade or less. He seemed satisfied with Masaki's development and showed no signs of concern about the succession arrangements. Whatever doubts he might have had about elevating a second son rather than a firstborn had apparently been resolved by watching Masaki mature into responsibility. In Takamaru's third year away, Okiyo finally received permission to visit him. The journey took 2 weeks by palanquin, travelling through domains and past checkpoints, showing papers that identified her as a member of Lord Sakai's household travelling to visit relatives in a distant domain. When she arrived at Lady Sakai's father's household, she was received with courtesy appropriate to someone connected to an allied family. She was given guest chambers and allowed to rest from the journey. Then, the following morning, Takamaru was brought to her. He was 11 years old now, tall for his age, his face showing the angles of approaching adolescence. He entered the room where she waited and bowed formally, with the perfect posture and timing of someone who'd been thoroughly trained in proper etiquette. "Mother," he said, his voice already deeper than she remembered, "I am honoured by your visit." The formality of his greeting broke her heart. This was not the spontaneous affection of the 8-year-old boy who had climbed into her lap and chattered about building block castles. This was a young man who had been taught how to greet a visiting relative with appropriate dignity. "Takamaru," she said, her voice catching slightly, "come sit with me. Let me look at you." He moved to sit at the prescribed polite distance, kneeling with his hands properly placed on his knees. She searched his face for the child she remembered and found traces, the shape of his eyes, the set of his mouth, but overlaid with the person he was becoming. A person shaped by 3 years in a household she had never seen, educated by teachers she had never met, influenced by experiences she had not shared. "Tell me about your studies," she said, needing to hear his voice to understand who he had become. He described his education with the careful recitation of a student reporting to a supervisor. He was learning classical Chinese texts, practicing calligraphy that his teachers praised, studying military strategy and domain administration, training in swordsmanship and horsemanship. He had friends among the other boys in the household, including the sons of Lady Sakai's father by a secondary wife. He was treated well and given opportunities to demonstrate his abilities. She listened to this recitation and heard nothing of how he felt about any of it. The report could have been written by his teachers. It contained no personal reaction or emotional content. He had learned to present himself formally, to speak of duties and accomplishments rather than feelings or experiences. "Do you remember our house in Koishikawa?" she asked, trying to reach past the formal presentation to the child underneath. "Do you remember your block castles and your calligraphy practice?" "Yes, mother, I remember." His face softened slightly, showing a glimpse of the child he had been. "I remember you teaching me to write your name so I would not forget it. And have you forgotten?" "No. I practice writing it sometimes when I'm working on my calligraphy." This admission, small as it was, gave her hope that he had not entirely transformed into the formal young man who sat before her. Some part of the child she had raised remained, even if it was buried beneath layers of education and adaptation. They spent 3 days together, gradually becoming more comfortable with each other, though never quite recovering the easy intimacy they had once shared. He showed her his calligraphy, which was indeed excellent, and demonstrated some basic sword forms he'd learned. She told him about the household in Koishikawa, about Fumiko and Akiko, about the daily life he'd once known. On the last day, when she was preparing to depart for the return journey, he finally asked the question she had been dreading. "Mother, when may I come home?" She had to force herself to meet his eyes. "Not yet. Your education is not complete. You must remain here until you are fully prepared for your adult responsibilities." "But I miss you. I miss our house. I miss—" He trailed off, unable to articulate all the things he missed. "I know. I miss you too, more than I can say. But this separation is necessary. It is keeping you safe and giving you opportunities you would not have if you had stayed." Safe from what? She had known this question would come eventually. He was old enough now to wonder why he'd been sent away, to understand that official explanations about honour and education might not be the complete truth. Safe from political complications that you're too young to fully understand. Your position in our household is delicate. Being here, distant from those complications, allows you to grow up without being caught in various schemes and conflicts. He absorbed this partial explanation, clearly understanding that she was not telling him everything, but accepting that perhaps he was not yet ready to know all the details. "Will I see you again before I'm allowed to come home?" "I hope so, but I cannot promise when. These visits are not easy to arrange." He nodded, fighting to maintain the composure he'd been taught while also dealing with the emotions of a child who wanted his mother. She pulled him into an embrace, holding him close for a moment, and felt him relax against her, allowing himself to be the child he no longer usually showed to anyone. "Remember that I love you," she whispered. "Remember that everything I have done has been to protect you. Remember." "I will remember," he promised. Then he stepped back, bowed formally, and left the room with the dignity appropriate to a young samurai in training. She watched him go, knowing it might be years before she saw him again, and wondered whether the person he would be by their next meeting would retain any connection to the child she'd raised. The journey back to Koishikawa felt longer than the journey out had been. She returned to her chambers, which were exactly as she had left them, and resumed her life in the household. The visit had reassured her that Takamaru was indeed safe and well educated, but it had also confirmed that the separation had fundamentally changed their relationship. He was growing up without her, becoming someone she would have to get to know anew when he finally returned. 5 more years passed. Takamaru remained in Lady Sakai's father's household, completing his education and developing into a capable young man. The quarterly reports continued to arrive, gradually showing his progression from adolescence into early adulthood. Okiyo visited him twice more during those years, each visit following the same pattern. Formal greetings, careful conversations, brief glimpses of emotional connection before separation resumed. Masaki reached 21 years old, fully prepared for succession whenever his father might pass or choose to retire. Lord Sakai, now 57, began the gradual process of transferring administrative responsibilities to his son, preparing for eventual full transition of power. Lady Sakai, approaching 50 herself, maintained her influence while also preparing to step back into the less active role appropriate to a retired lord's wife. The household had achieved stability. The succession was secure. The factions that had formed around Yoshitaka's death had dissolved or been absorbed into new configurations of power and influence. Nobumasa had grown older and less ambitious, his own sons now mature and established in positions of respect if not supreme authority. Fumiko had finally borne a son when she was 28, giving her security in her position, though not the elevation that Okiyo's son had briefly represented. Akiko, the third concubine, remained childless and increasingly resigned to permanent subordination without the validation that children would have provided. When Takamaru turned 16, it was decided he should return to Koishikawa for a formal presentation to the household. He had been away for 8 years, had been educated thoroughly, and was now ready to begin his adult life. The question was what that life would look like. He arrived on a spring morning, travelling with an escort from Lady Sakai's father's household. Okiyo stood in the courtyard as his palanquin arrived, her heart pounding with anticipation and anxiety about seeing the man her son had become. When he emerged and stood before her, she barely recognized him. He was tall, nearly as tall as his father, with his father's bearing and his father's face matured past childhood. He wore the clothing of a young samurai of respectable rank, his swords properly positioned, his posture correct and confident. He bowed to her formally with the deep respect appropriate for greeting one's mother after long absence. "Mother, I have returned." She returned his bow, then stepped forward and embraced him, no longer caring about proper formality. He allowed the embrace, even returned it, though his movements were careful and controlled rather than spontaneous. "Welcome home," she said quietly. "Thank you." He stepped back and looked around the compound. "It is smaller than I remembered. Or perhaps I am larger." She laughed, relieved that he could make such an observation, that some capacity for lightness remained in him despite the formal training. Both are probably true. He was presented to Lord Sakai, who received him with satisfaction, and acknowledged him as a properly educated young man ready for responsibilities in the domain's administration. He met with Masaki, now the confident heir apparent, and the two young men bowed to each other with the correct mutual respect of half-brothers who occupied very different positions in the hierarchy. He saw Lady Sakai, who treated him with careful courtesy that acknowledged both his status as Lord Sakai's son and his permanent subordination to Masaki. A position was offered, assistant to one of the senior administrators managing tax collection and rice distribution in the domain. It was respectable work, appropriate to his education and his status as Lord Sakai's acknowledged son by a concubine. It was not glamorous or powerful, but it was secure and provided adequate income to maintain himself appropriately. He accepted the position with formal gratitude. He would maintain chambers in his father's residence, though separate from the family's private areas. He would work during the day alongside other young samurai of similar rank. He would build relationships and demonstrate competence. He would live the life that had been arranged for him, shaped by decisions made when he was a child who played with wooden blocks and practiced calligraphy with his mother's guidance. On his third evening back in Koishikawa, he came to visit Okiyo in her chambers. They sat together in the space where he had grown up for his first 8 years, and for the first time since his return, the formal presentation dropped away and she saw hints of the child he had been. "I am glad to be back," he said, "though I'm not sure this feels entirely like home anymore." "Where does feel like home?" she asked. "Nowhere completely. The place I lived for 8 years was never truly mine, and this place..." He gestured at her chambers. "I remember it, but more like a dream than a real experience. That is the cost of what was done to protect you. You lost your home, your childhood familiarity, your connection to your early life. I am sorry that was necessary." "Was it necessary?" He looked at her directly. "I am old enough now to understand some of what happened. The legitimate heir died. I might have been seen as an alternative, but would I really have been in danger if I had stayed? Or was I sent away because I was inconvenient to other people's plans?" She considered how to answer honestly without creating resentment or damaging his view of those who had made decisions about his life. "You were in danger because your existence created possibilities that various people wanted to exploit or eliminate. Sending you away removed you from immediate calculations about succession. Whether you would have actually been harmed if you had stayed, I do not know. I only know that the risk seemed real, and Lady Sakai and I decided that distance was the safest option. Lady Sakai decided, you agreed, there is a difference. Yes, I agreed because I believed she was right, because I had no power to refuse even if I had wanted to, and because keeping you alive seemed more important than keeping you close. He absorbed this, his face showing the complex emotions of someone coming to understand how little control any of them had really had over their own lives. Do you resent her, Lady Sakai? No, she did what she believed necessary to protect her son. I did what I believed necessary to protect you. Our interests aligned, so we cooperated. That cooperation kept both of you alive and safe. And now? What happens now? Now you build the life that is available to you. You work competently. You cultivate relationships. You make yourself useful and valued. You do not attempt to exceed your position, but you also do not diminish yourself. You become the kind of man your father respects and your half-brother can rely on. A loyal subordinate to Masaki who will one day be daimyo. Yes, that is what I am training to become. It is an honorable position. Many samurai occupy similar roles throughout Japan. You will have security, status, and the opportunity to serve your domain well. But I will never be more than what I am now. A concubine's son, useful but never central, valued but never vital. She heard the disappointment in his voice and understood it. He had been raised with stories of his grandfather's service at Sekigahara, had been educated alongside daimyo's sons, had been treated with respect appropriate to a lord's acknowledged offspring. But all of that education and respect had been preparation for permanent subordination. That is the truth of your position, she said gently, but it is not a small truth. Many people in Japan have no security at all, no status, no opportunity to use their education meaningfully. You have all of these things. The question is whether you can find satisfaction in what you have rather than resentment about what you cannot have. He sat quietly considering this. Then he spoke again, his voice softer. Do you think you made the right choice? Sending me away? I think I made the only choice I could make with the information and options I had at that moment. Whether it was right, that is something only you can ultimately judge, years from now when you understand how your life unfolded because of it. I do not resent you, he said. I want you to know that. I understand that you are trying to protect me. I just wish. He trailed off, unable to articulate exactly what he wished for. I know, she said. I wish many things too. But we must live with what is, not with what we wish had been. They sat together in the lamplight, mother and son reunited after 8 years of separation, both changed by the time apart, both trying to find their way back to some form of connection, despite the fundamental alteration of their relationship. Will you visit me in my new chambers, he asked, after I move into the separate wing? If you wish me to. Though we should be careful about how often we meet to avoid creating impressions that might be problematic. Always careful, always aware of how things might appear. He shook his head slightly. I will need to learn that skill, the constant calculation of how every action will be perceived. You already learned it, she said. You practiced it for 8 years in a household that was not your own, managing perceptions and maintaining appropriate behaviour. You know how to do this. You simply need to continue doing it here. He nodded, acknowledging the truth of this. They talked a while longer, about less weighty matters, gradually relaxing into each other's company. When he finally rose to leave, he embraced her once more, and this time the embrace felt less formal, more genuine. Thank you for keeping me alive, he said quietly, even if the cost was high. After he left, Okiyo remained sitting in her chambers, thinking about everything that had transpired over the past 8 years. the sudden crisis that had transformed her quiet life into something dangerous and complex. The alliance with Lady Sakai that had protected her son but required his exile. The long years of separation and the uncertain reunion. The man her child had become, shaped by forces she could not control and carrying the weight of a position he had not chosen. She thought about the bow Lady Sakai had given her 8 years ago, the gesture that had signalled everything was changing. She thought about Yoshitaka's death, the fever that had killed the heir apparent and set in motion all that followed. She thought about the choices she had made, some freely, some under duress, all of them carrying consequences she was still learning to understand. In the end, she was still a concubine in Lord Sakai's household. Her position had not formally changed. She still occupied the same chambers, still performed the same duties, still existed in the ambiguous space between servant and family. But she had learned things about power and survival that she had not understood before. She had formed alliances, made sacrifices, and navigated dangers she had never imagined would touch her life. And her son had survived. He was here, whole and educated and ready to build a life. That was what mattered most. Not that his life would be exactly what she had once imagined for him, but that he had a life at all. That the 8-year-old boy who'd been sent away had returned as a 16-year-old young man capable of managing the position circumstances had created for him. The night deepened. The household settled into quiet. Beyond her chambers, in the great mansion of Lord Sakai, people slept in their various positions. Lord and lady, heir apparent, concubines, servants, retainers. Each person occupying a defined space in the intricate hierarchy that structured their lives. Okiyo prepared for sleep in the chambers that had been hers for 13 years now. She had arrived here as a young woman of 21, uncertain and hopeful. She had borne a son and raised him for 8 years. She had lost him to political necessity and waited 8 more years for his return. She had formed alliances and made enemies, learned skills she had never wanted to learn, discovered strengths she had not known she possessed. She lay down on her futon and looked through the open screen at the small garden beyond her chambers. The moon was bright, illuminating the carefully placed stones and the dwarf pine that had been there when she arrived, and would be there long after she was gone. The garden was unchanging, a small piece of deliberate tranquility in a world that had proven far more turbulent than she had ever imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new choices. Takamaru would begin his work in the domain's administration. She would continue her role as concubine and informal ally to Lady Sakai. The household would proceed through its daily routines. Life would continue, not in the form anyone had planned or expected, but in the form that circumstances had created. She thought about the main wife's bow, all those years ago, the moment when everything had changed. She thought about how one unexpected gesture could signal transformation, how quickly apparent stability could dissolve, how little control any of them really had over the forces that shaped their lives. But she also thought about resilience, about the human capacity to adapt to circumstances that seemed impossible to survive. She had endured separation from her son. She had formed alliances with former adversaries. She had learned to navigate political complexities that had once been invisible to her. She had survived. The night was quiet, peaceful. The spring air carried the scent of early blossoms. In the distance she could hear the faint sound of the night watchman making his rounds, the wooden clappers marking the late hour. The city of Koishikawa slept around the Sakai mansion, and within the mansion its occupants rested in preparation for whatever tomorrow might bring. Okiyo's breathing slowed, deepened, as sleep began to claim her. Her last conscious thought was of Takamaru, safe in his own chambers now, beginning his life as an adult in this household, carrying forward the family's service into another generation. The cost had been high, the path difficult, but he had survived. They had both survived. And tomorrow the sun would rise and life would continue its patient, inexorable unfolding toward whatever futures waited in the darkness beyond knowing.